Welcome to the second day of our Media Futures conference. My name is Omar El-Ghazi. I am an associate professor here at the department, and I am very happy to be chairing the second plenary entitled Imagining New Realities, a 21st Century Take on Justice. I will first introduce our great speakers, and then we will begin to have kind of like a conversation amongst each other about the notion centered around the notion of justice. We opted for kind of a more conversation style panel. We know it's early in the morning and the second day, so hopefully, it will be more interesting. To my right is Yasmin El-Rifae, who is a writer and editor. Her first book, Radius, A Story of Feminist Revolution, was published by Verso in 2022. The book follows the story of a group of women and men who formed Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment, OP-ANTISH, that's the acronym, in Egypt, in the years following the 2011 revolution, as mass sexual assaults were happening in Tahrir Square in Cairo. OP-ANTISH deployed hundreds of volunteers, scouts, rescue teams, and getaway drivers to intervene in cases of sexual violence against women protesting in the square. El-Rifae was one of OP-ANTISH's organizers, and the book is an intimate and evocative account of the group's work. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Granta, Mada Masr, and other outlets. She is also a producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature. Lina Dencik is professor in digital communication and society at Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Culture, and co-founder and director of the Data Justice Lab. Her research concerns the interplay between media developments and social and political change, with a particular focus on resistance, governance, and the politics of data. Lina works across a number of projects and is a principal investigator on the project Data Justice, funded by a starting grant from the European Research Council. With the Data Justice Lab, she has also worked on two further projects, Data Scores as Governance, and is currently working on a 2-year project towards democratic auditing. She has published 5 books, including the latest, The Media Manifesto, with Natalie Fenton, Des Friedman, and Justin Scholzberg. It was published by Polity Press in 2020. She holds a PhD from Goldsmith University of London and has previously worked at the Central European University in Budapest. And my colleague, Dr. Sita Pena Gangadaran, is associate professor here in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE. Her work focuses on inclusion, exclusion, and marginalization, as well as questions around democracy and social justice and technological governance. She currently co-leads 2 projects, Our Data Buddies, which examines the impact of data collection and data-driven technologies on members of marginalized communities in the United States, and Justice, Equity, and Technology, which explores the impacts of data-driven technologies and infrastructures on European civil society. She is also a visiting scholar in the School of Media Studies at the New School, affiliated fellow of Yale Law School's Information Society Project, an affiliate fellow of Data Society Research Institute. Before joining the department in 2015, Sita was senior research fellow at New America's Open Technology Institute, addressing policies and practices related to digital inclusion, privacy, and big data. She received her PhD from Stanford University and holds a master's from the department here at LSE. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully, we can think together about how justice appears in your work and your experience now with kind of a trajectory to the future. I'm going to start with you, Yasmin, because kind of I want to hear more about the book, about the experience of how you contributed to starting OP-ANTISH back in 2011. Why you decided to write a book about this, and if you could also reflect a bit on looking back on the notion of justice and how that appeared. So let's start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for including me and inviting me into this conversation. Thank you all for coming. So yeah, I'll speak a little bit, I guess, a little bit more about what was happening that required that something like Opantish form and happen. So about a year and a half into the 2011 revolution in Egypt, we started to see a pattern of mob sexual assaults against women happening in Tahrir Square, which many of you will know and remember was the sort of iconic heart and, in many ways, one of the most strategically and politically important spaces throughout the uprising. And these attacks would often, because the sort of all of the ideas and practice concerning justice and everything I've been thinking about with regards to justice since then, it comes from this very like embodied experience and in many ways the fight that was fought back then. So it's important to sort of talk a little bit about what was actually happening in these mobs and what Opantish had to do in order to do its work. So we believe that there was at least some premeditation to this violence, because when there had been one-off instances of mob violence in the square before, but when it became this nightly pattern, we would often see the attacks starting spontaneously. So you'd have multiple attacks beginning at the same time in the square, and they would often begin with a small number of men, like 3 or 4 men, separating a woman from whoever she was with and beginning to inflict violence against her. And the thing that was truly horrifying was that this would then grow into a bigger crowd. And it's important to note, especially with what we're trying to talk and think about here, that these mobs were incredibly chaotic, yes, incredibly violent, but also included people doing all kinds of things. It included people trying to help. It would include people trying to sort of film what was happening on their phone as a record, people trying to figure out what was happening. A lot of people were pickpocketed in the course of being in these mobs and doing the work that Opantish did. So there was all kinds of things happening in these mobs. And very quickly, once women started posting their testimonies online, debriefing members of human rights groups about what was happening to them, women who'd survived attacks, but also witnesses who'd seen things happen, people who tried to help friends who'd been attacked. All of this went public very quickly. And because it was a time of revolution and rebellion and sort of self-organization, almost immediately a few groups of people spontaneously began to group themselves together and try and help. So Opantish, when it first began, was, we had very little idea what we were doing. We went out as a group of people who tied pink ribbons around our arms so that we could identify each other in the crowd. We had no idea how to move through a crowd, how to protect ourselves against this violence. And Opantish basically grew into a more organized operation from one of these very spontaneous efforts. And there were I can name 2 other groups that sort of became more organized about trying to do this work. Opantish was slightly different politically from the other 2 groups in that it identified itself as a radical feminist group that saw itself as doing work within the revolution. So Opantish was both trying to save women, to pull women out of this violence, out of these mobs, but also to insist that this fight was central to the continuation of any revolutionary struggle in the wider sense, which was important because, as is so often the case, as soon as women started speaking out about this violence and people started trying to do something about it, many revolutionary political groups and activists tried to silence it and say, this is ruining the image of the square, as if the effort to talk about it or solve it is what's ruining any image of anything. So the group was led by women. I mean, it relied on the efforts of both women and men, but the sort of the decision making about strategies and tactics and language was made by women, which was something we felt was really important because it also was one of the things that allowed us to insist on women's ability to participate and right to participate in the group on any level. So from intervening within the intervention teams on the ground to helping take care of survivors once they'd been pulled out of mobs, answering hotlines. By at its peak, Opantish had like a sort of operational structure that involved a control room that was receiving phone calls and reports on hotlines, and also trying to document things at the end of the night, as well as coordinate movement on the ground. It had intervention teams that were doing the core work of trying to essentially fight their ways into mobs. And it took, again, this was a very steep learning curve. A lot of people were hurt. A lot of women in particular were targeted themselves, especially in the earlier days of doing this work in the course of trying to help one another. But over time, we learned how to more effectively and safely sort of move through the crowds, and were able to enlist the kinds of numbers we needed, basically, to like be an effective force. So pivoting slightly from this talk of strategy and movement and tactics, and giving you as well a sense of some of the sort of politics of the group, if I think about justice, there are a couple of things that have, that stick with me and that also seem like maybe useful takeaways to thinking about other parts of life. There's of course at the core of it the sort of political battle for justice that was being fought on like these parallel levels, right? So on the one hand, trying to insist that violence against a certain type of body, in this case women's bodies, can't be kind of circled off or separated from wider calls for justice, certainly from wider calls for revolutionary justice, that once you start excluding, invisibilizing, diminishing some kind of violence or sharp injustice like this, there can't actually be justice for anyone else. There is no such thing as, justice for the few in the real sense or in the useful sense. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that out of practice, but also out of a sort of, I want to say almost like a philosophy, Opantish was non-punitive in its work. So because we very quickly realized, you were dealing with all kinds of, when you try and organize an effort like this, people come in to volunteer and they have all sorts of ideas about what they're gonna do, right? So you get lots of like eager young men who really want to like beat up the bad guys and be the heroes. You get lots of sort of very strident feminists shutting them down and saying, no, this is a feminist group and we're not going to rely on like machismo tropes and so on. And that was a big part of the project here, but also on a sort of on a just practical level, it was nearly impossible to identify within these mobs who was doing what. And also there was this very painful and fracturing experience that many women reported of where men would be both actually in the same moment, both helping and hurting them at the same time. So sort of leading them out of the mob, but having a hand down their pants. So this idea of we're gonna pick out the bad guys and beat them up just wasn't really possible. And it also, we quickly learned that the safest, most effective thing to actually do is to get in and out as fast as you can and actually not try to add to the violence, the chaos, the sort of frenziedness of what is happening in these crowds. So people didn't go in, a few people carried weapons, but they kept them concealed. If they were carrying like a stick or something, people didn't go in waving things around. And I feel like this kind of keeping the frame and the focus on the women, on the survivors, on the work of getting them out and caring for them was incredibly liberating and allowed the group to do its work more successfully. And then, because it also raised all kinds of questions, like in a sort of, in a context like that, where you're in a public square, the state is in a state of political upheaval. What do you do when you identify the perpetrators? What are you going to do? Are you going to beat them up? Are you going to kill them? Are you going to take them to the police who are, horrific perpetrators of sexual violence themselves against detainees. So there were all kinds of sort of questions that it actually liberated us from, which I think could be useful in thinking of other forms of organizing work that demand us to kind of to come together and do something for one another, right? And the other thing in terms of tactics that this will be the last point I'll make here is one of the most sort of startling. So the book Radius that's about Opantish took me many years to write. It's based on my own experience, of course, but it's also, I really didn't want to write it as a memoir. That was the one thing I was sure of when I started out. I didn't want to be the sort of central narrative voice that it didn't feel like something I could do. It also felt like it would be somehow really impoverished. And what was clear to me was that this thing had been so big and people's experiences had really differed depending on whether they were men or women or Egyptian or not, and what their roles had been and when. So in the sort of, after the very violent coup that ended the revolution and effectively ended the work of Opantish in 2013, I kind of took myself to New York to get some distance, and I very slowly started, in my visits back to Cairo, I started recording interviews and conversations with other organizers of the group, and the book is basically very much based on those conversations. The story of Opantish is told through the perspectives of four people. They're not, I mean, they're characters, but it's all real, even though I use pseudonyms except in one case. And it's kind of, and then, so the story of Opantish is told mostly through their perspectives, and then there's a more reflective thread that kind of weaves in and out that tries to reflect on the experience from both a temporal and a geographic distance. And one of the most startling things that came up in the course of one of these conversations was told to me by a friend who, you know, this person was also a friend before and after we had done this work together. And he basically, his name is Adam in the book, and he told me about how one of the things that he and the rest of the people in his intervention team learned to do and began doing as a strategy was that they would go, once they were in the mob, and one of the tactic, the sort of formation that we had landed on towards the end was forming a sort of trying to form a safe passageway into once we'd found the woman in the center of the mob, and then a small group that had to include women volunteers would go in through that passageway towards her, and then come back out the same way. But often you needed to enlist the help of the crowd around you, both to kind of help you move through or to join in making the corridor or whatever. And he basically described to me picking people out of the crowd, almost always people who were men, people who looked like they were actively engaged in some kind of bodily fight. So not necessarily, you know, harassing the woman directly, but, you know, being quite violent. He described doing this with someone who had a belt raised in the air and speaking to them very softly, as quietly as you can in a situation like that, and basically speaking to them as if Adam, was expecting them to be on Adam's side, was expecting that this person is there to try and help the woman. And he said that almost always what this would do was that it would work. Mm-hmm. That these men would change whatever it was they were doing to come into this, you know, I think it helped that there was a group with t-shirts, come into this force and participate in actively helping get this woman out. So there's something here, I mean, aside from, of course, the very heightened and extreme circumstances, but there's something here about this that I find really useful today, especially when we talk about gender violence and how we deal with sexual abuse, but also, I would say, generally, politics on the left, in different contexts, different geographic contexts, this insistence on the idea that we can change one another's behaviors, that we can influence one another's politics, mm-hmm. that we can, I don't know, I feel like so often, especially when we talk about gender and sexuality and sexual rights and sexual abuse, but also more broadly, I don't know, there's this feeling that people expect one another to show up with the right kind of politics, and I feel like we've sort of abdicated the idea and even the responsibility on a more sort of societal, communal level that we can change one another's minds, and that in fact we are always changing and influencing one another. And I think this is even more important to bring to the table because, as we all know, we live in like politically disastrous times. And the Sisi's coming to power through the coup was that the sort of part of the wave of these kinds of regimes coming to power all around the world. And these forces, we can call them whatever, call them reactionary, right-wing, fascist. They know this very well, and they don't stop trying to influence and change people. So this is also the I would say the main takeaway for me.
Thank you. No, that's a great point. And of course, like yesterday the word evil was mentioned in the first panel. One of the sources of evil, we can say, are big tech. So that's a good segue to the work of Sita and Lina, particularly that they actually kind of focus on how big tech relates to justice and affects marginalized communities. So Sita, I turn to you if you also tell us about kind of how the idea of justice evolved in your work and how you think of it in relation to big tech.
No small question. So I want to speak through a project that I'm currently engaged with my beautiful collaborators and co-leads of our data bodies, Mariela Saba, Kim Soriano, Kim M. Reynolds, who's an alumna of LSE, and Blue Lewis. And it's new work that is focused on workplace surveillance at big tech. And it's looking and working with worker organizers and current and former workers at Amazon fulfillment centers. We've spoken to a range of Amazon employees, and it sort of ranges from, there are a couple of drivers, but most of the people are actually on the shop floor. So in these gigantic warehouses that are miles and miles long, either doing work like picking, packing, scanning, and really just physically exhausting themselves. So I can step back actually a little bit to say the work, I think, was originally sort of, we got approached by a worker organization called United for Respect. So we're partnering with this group. And some of you may be familiar with the fact that in the United States, labor rights were basically eviscerated, really starting and ramping up through the 70s, and unions and worker organizing in general is sort of a blank spot in US American culture. And so this organization has been, I think they have, tens of thousands of members. They sort of started thinking about retail workers and started organizing around that, and have since moved to a focus on big tech. So it's one piece of where big tech kind of fits into questions of social justice, of racial justice, and economic justice. And what we've been doing, it's like exceedingly difficult work, partly because it is very difficult to find people that will speak with you, for one thing. Even with the partnership with this worker rights organization, it's really difficult. And the main reason is because people are just working, right? There's no time in the day to actually get anything done for themselves, let alone take the time to speak to another organizer or / organizer, researcher. But what we've, I think in the back of my mind, I've been sort of wondering, like, how does this experience in the workplace of surveillance and constant monitoring relate to the asymmetric power that Amazon holds, economic, political power that Amazon holds, and seeing if we could draw a thread. But in reality, once you start speaking with people and they start telling their stories, it's a lot more complicated than that. And so I just want to just share a couple of things that we've, at this point in the research, found, which is that, Amazon represents an opportunity for a lot of people. Tens of thousands of people are employed in low-wage jobs. You don't have to actually go through a significant vetting process. You can just get hired. And on the other side of that, so there's a lot of pride that goes with, I got a job with a big company. It's a big name, everybody knows it, and it has a certain amount of respectability. And yet then when people get inside and they're actually sort of pushed physically to the limit, right? They start sort of having this tension between, okay, I'm at this company, actually they're not paying me enough, and sometimes I have to, either not eat or hold, I can't go to the bathroom because in order to do that, I have to walk like 15 minutes. And then I have to walk 15 minutes back to my spot. So I can't really afford to take that break. And if I take that break, I'm not only screwing up my whole floor and all of the people that I'm working with, but I'm likely to be caught on camera, and I'm not actually contributing to the packing. And so I'm not making my performance rate, the performance threshold, and therefore I'm going to be punished, right? So, there's this tension between a sort of pride with being part of this big company, but then a realization that actually it's physically impossible. It's emotionally draining. There's a constant level of anxiety that exists, that you're not actually, because you're sort of working as if you were a machine. We had this great quote from somebody that said, "My boss is the scanner," right? And there was another person that said something like, a lot of people don't want to go into scanning because they know they're watched so easily, and that, the minute that they just dip in their performance rate, in their task rate, they're going to be punished. It's an exceedingly difficult context to walk into and to work in, obviously, and it's a place of deep isolation. So you have this extremely extractive environment where people are just being squeezed of their physical capacity. And they're also usually isolated. So you might be just in a small space, like getting packages and scanning them, and you don't see another person for the entire day. And that's really, that's devastating. And then you don't also have the opportunity to really organize with your fellow workers, because not only are you physically isolated, but because your task rate is set so high, and there are cameras everywhere, and Amazon is very, they hire you to fire you, right? They hire you to fire you because they can afford to do that. So if you just do something wrong that doesn't match their performance model, you can be fired or let go, terminated, and there's very little that people find that they can do about it. So I guess, how does justice show up in the work? I guess because I haven't, I'm normally looking at surveillance and profiling and privacy issues not in the workplace, right? The work that we've done with our data bodies prior to here is really looking at racialized policing, sort of, hyper surveillance, over policing in a variety of contexts, and it in some ways feels very similar in the workplace as it does in these other, parts of urban centers where people are really, they're just constantly watched. And I guess what I would say is, and this has been our experience, I think, with doing this kind of participatory / research / organizing work, which is it takes a long time to get things moving. I mean, the minute that we started speaking with people, they definitely open up. And the minute that we bring this conversation back to workers, they open up even further. But it's not going to happen in a short amount of time, even with, occasionally we've seen in the press and in Congress that there have been concerns, but it's definitely not going to happen overnight. And we're still going to be contending with people that, again, are actually proud to be working in these places. They're not going to have a quick analysis of racialized capitalism or predatory capitalism. That's just going to take time.
Thank you. Yeah, Lina?
Yeah, thank you. I had prepared something else, but now I'll respond to Yasmin and Sita's comments instead and talk a bit about that in relation to my work. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this. Thanks, Sita and Omar as well. I've been doing, it's very much inspired also by Sita's long-standing work and the Our Data Buddies project. We've done work that's focused on Europe, particularly to try and get an understanding of how particularly data and datafication ties in with justice, but datafication here is used loosely to encompass also big tech generally and other forms of data-intensive technologies. But we've looked at that in areas where we feel that there are real kind of contentious issues around justice and where marginalized communities are likely to be very present. So that has been in policing and law enforcement context, it's been in migration context, and it's been in workplaces, and particularly low-wage work, although not warehouses. We've looked at call centers and also other forms of sort of teleperformance-related work. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was to try and understand how these two, datafication and social justice, intersect, in part to try and sort of shift us away from dominant debates around it, which have been very focused on digital rights, and to try and shift our understanding towards these issues that encompass social justice agendas more broadly. And I think one of the things that we've thought about a lot is the way in which these technologies are part of shaping life opportunities for people in these contexts in various different ways. And so a lot of the work initially was to try and actually get to grips with these experiences of social injustice in particular, and understand the nature of those and what those were. And we've done a lot of work on that and sort of mapping developments within these areas, but also speaking to impacted communities to get a sense of what is it actually people feel about the uses of technologies in these kind of contentious areas where social justice has a long history. And I think, I'll bring to the table with this now, because I feel like we've had really rich stories of the kinds of injustices we're talking about. I think sort of what's important is that we have obviously sort of a kind of a big debate now, particularly in Europe, about some of these injustices that people experience, often discussed in terms of rights. And we've had a sort of movement from, a lot of discussion was around individual privacy initially, to now discrimination being really mainstreamed within EU policy debate in particular, as a key issue with particularly AI. And I think you know, Margrethe Vestager just recently said that discrimination is the issue about AI, not these kind of existential threats, but actually discrimination is the issue. And I think we've also seen that from industry responding to that with things like fairness design and so forth, that sort of talks about algorithmic discrimination and algorithmic bias. And we've also seen it, you know, in industry and civil society to some extent, with this emphasis on ethics, which would often sort of privilege also questions of transparency, privacy, and discrimination. But I think what's interesting from our research around in terms of how it relates to justice is actually when it comes to people's experiences of these technologies, that doesn't actually correspond with a lot of those types of efforts to address some of these social justice concerns. In fact, most people experience these injustices to be linked to existing social relations, if you like, structures that are already in place. So even in our research on workplace relations, for example, people are not really wanting digital rights or data rights. What they want is issues like co-determination within the workplace, having a say on how technology or other types of workplace issues are happening. They locate the challenge around surveillance, for example, and so forth, in relations with managers, in business models, in capitalism, you know, those kinds of much bigger sort of structural conditions. So there isn't, I think one of the sort of future issues around this stuff around justice is actually how these two things relate. The fact that we're having a justice debate, if you like, particularly within Europe, in policy, with technology, with parts of civil society, that doesn't necessarily correspond with people's lived experiences of these technologies. And I think that's what our research is at least pointing towards. So how can we, I suppose, rescue justice? Because I think one of the things that are happening is this is a kind of equilibrium that's being created in the Gramscian sense, in that there is this kind of sense of we can take account of these social justice concerns that have now become more mainstreamed around the uses of these technologies in a way that is conducive to the expansion of an AI market and a data market, so marketization processes that sort of sidelines any kind of fundamental question around premise or other ways in which these kind of underlying conditions might actually be challenged that will essentially empower people if changed. So I think, you know, that's kind of, for me, the sort of outcome of our research that I think links to the experiences we've heard about here as well, that we are having different debates happening in different spheres as to the meaning of justice, and there's a real kind of political game happening around that, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. And yeah, like if we think back to kind of technology in 2011, you know, like it was such a hopeful moment of how these platforms could be kind of used to empower people. I think yesterday Miriam mentioned the idea of synchronicity between kind of revolutionary politics and the use of platforms. So I wonder if, like, is that even possible anymore to kind of harness platforms for more revolutionary progressive politics, or are we past that? So maybe starting with you, Yasmin, just if you know, we are media scholars here, if you reflect on the story of Pantish and think about like the kind of the questions of mediation and technology, what do you think are lessons that we can draw on from your experience?
Yeah, the question of, I mean, Pantish and the internet, but also the broader sort of struggle of the Egyptian Revolution and the Arab Spring at large, which has ended with such, you know, horror. Wars and coups and fascism is basically what we've ended up with, and I think it can be a bit like I think there are two things I want to say. One is that, of course, you know, these things are tools and should be used as tools from my perspective, and they still are. It's very hard to see how, for example, queer communities or the families of political prisoners or other sort of extremely marginalized and struggling groups, human rights workers in Egypt, would do any of their work without the connectivity of social media platforms, while of course being aware of, you know, their problems. But that also, it's the sort of the swerve away from the optimism towards the darkness that we perceive when we look at like social media platforms in particular is mirrored by this experience. And I'll speak specifically of Egypt, but I do think more broadly in the region, of watching the masses turn, right? This kind of sense of betrayal that many people of my generation felt in Egypt when the masses, and literally I mean the hundreds of thousands of people in the street, went from calling for bread, freedom, and social justice to calling for a military coup, to, you know, applauding a massacre. All of that, that is the sort of psychic and political crack that is very, very hard to get over and to move on from, to talking about any of these questions that we're talking about today. And I think the important thing to braid in is that, yeah, how do we go back to rather just, instead of seeing these two things as like mirrors of defeat and darkness and feeling sort of like overpowered by them and by the history that we've lived and experienced of that, to remembering that, again, to go back to this strategy that Adam shared with me, to remembering that, yes, like masses are fickle and changeable, and people and their politics are fickle and changeable, and we can have a role to play here. And there's, of course, this is much easier said in, you know, in this room and after having had 10 years to sort of think about this, but I think it's important when we're talking about these histories as well to be careful of the language, you know, that we use around them, because the language itself can become a trap. When you talk about the failure of a revolution or the defeat of a generation, it can be very hard when you're part of that defeat and that failure to move past that, right? So yeah, so I really see them as like mirrors of one another, I guess.
Thank you. Sita?
So many thoughts, right? I mean, if I think about where I was in 2011, I was working at this place that was mentioned in the bio, New America's Open Technology Institute. And yeah, a lot could be written about that experience. But, you know, we were in an environment where, with Arab Spring, my colleagues were trying to develop internet in a suitcase, right? All of this stuff around liberation technology and, yeah, sort of a very kind of branded and specific type of democracy being kind of implanted on this idea like, oh, we can build new tools, we can build both the hardware and software and the infrastructures, right? And looking back at that time now, you know, it feels like that particular moment during the Obama administration was like a very good sales pitch that, you know, invited the tech industries to grow at the pace and with the intensity that they ended up growing with, right? Sort of this hyper-scaling, and I will not be able to remember what is like basically burn everything, fail fast. Does anybody remember what the saying is? Break things. Yeah. So, right, when I think about how certain actors, platform companies, were given a pass during that time, it's sort of horrifying, right, to think about where we are now and the fact that these technology companies no longer market themselves on democracy, right? It's a very different place. And even with the racial justice uprisings following the murder of George Floyd, right? You know, I mean, there's something very, really grotesque about how these companies have sort of flipped from that very optimistic advertising rhetoric to something that's sort of like pragmatic, violent perspective on how technologies need to be implanted and embedded in society. So, I mean, with that said, right, I think there are still, I think yesterday, was it Jonathan brought up the need for, just thinking about new infrastructures and how you do that. And I think some of the conversations that I'm having now, right, I'm sort of part of this, in the United States, this conversation on how to envision technology, affirmative visions for technology in the public interest. And I feel really uncomfortable a lot of the times with those conversations for a variety of reasons. But where I kind of end up falling is to say, right, if technology was an idea and a practice, a discourse, in the 19th century to basically distinguish between civilized and uncivilized populations, right, then actually I think we need to come up with a new practice and a new term for technology. Like maybe we just, over time, we can relieve ourselves of that idea as something that should and ought, or can and ought to order society, right? Maybe we don't want to order society with technology anymore. And that's a really difficult question to engage because it's sort of, right, like, what? How do you even do that? It sounds like totally fantastical. But in some sense, at least in the sort of networks and the communities of practice in which I'm engaged, right, it's, we're very aware of the fact that, yeah, sure, you need to use these platforms. You can't really get away with them. Yes, at the same time, we need to build new infrastructures. And, there's an awareness, and yet it's like we're not yet identifying with clarity what it is that we want instead of the thing that we have. So I feel like that's the hard work and that's the challenge, and it's unlikely to sort of surface and germinate in this lifetime. But as long as we keep kind of pushing that conversation, I think there's something sort of magical that can come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so it's about also, again, looking what are the, in some ways you can say it's not surprising that we have the kinds of platforms we have because the conditions are in place to nurture that sort of business model and so forth. So we might want to look at what conditions do we need for alternative platforms to emerge. But I also think, how can we challenge the existing ones that exist to replace them with something else? And I do think, and I just realized that in what I said before, I was very dismissive of digital rights, which I actually didn't mean to be, but just that it's not the end all of the sort of pursuit of justice, even in questions relating to technology. And I think that there can be some pushback with those kinds of tools and mechanisms and so forth, but we have to sort of, I guess, try and do more to envision a kind of completely different model. And also, by the way, I also wanted to mention around sustainability, which is something that we haven't touched upon yet, whereas we need different platforms because the ones we have at the moment are destroying the planet. And so we also are going to have to come up with something else out of necessity. And in fact, these are kinds of terms that perhaps will penetrate more. And this is where I think where I was going to go with this is also the question around how do we mobilize people? I mean, alternative platforms, alternative infrastructures need to come from mobilizing people around it. And so you need to identify terms that will mobilize people to do, to think that this is a necessity. And I'm not sure that at the moment in how we're debating and understanding these technologies and their relationship to justice that we are kind of have found the terms that actually will mobilize people to think that we need something else. I think there's a general distrust towards a lot of platforms and so forth, but I don't think that we necessarily have the language in place to talk about alternative infrastructures on terms that relate to people's experiences and why they're necessary. And that's, I think, happening also with the types of policy debates and so forth that are going on. It's not capturing people's imagination on terms that are going to mobilize. And I think that's a real problem, and that's something we need to look at.
And yeah, maybe I could pick up on that also in continuation of the conversation that we had yesterday about how for us as scholars, how do we kind of engage with communities and work with communities? Is that in itself kind of like a progressive pursuit? What are the ethics and politics of doing that? So I don't know, Sita, if you want to also reflect on having worked with marginalized communities, what are the kind of the
I'm sort of
that?
Brought back to Miriam's comments yesterday about sort of the fetishizing of participatory research, and I'm super aware of that because actually I was thinking, for the last 11 years now, 12 years, I think pretty much, except for a few exceptions, all of the research that I've done is participatory or collaborative in some form or fashion. And I can't really do it any other way. I mean, maybe eventually I will. I mean, these projects are like ongoing, right? The project that I described we began in 2015. And we're not done, and we're not going to be done anytime soon. But I mean, I think I'm not a sort of hardliner about like, oh, you only have to work with, communities that are usually excluded from these spaces, in part because I take at face value, I think there was a really beautiful article written by Maurice Mitchell called Building Resilient Organizations, in which he's sort of unpacking the sort of diagnosing some of the things that are holding back progressive left organizers, predominantly in the US, but just thinking about the different ways that things kind of implode in different movements. And one of the points that he makes is this point about sort of an ecology or a division of labor. And so I really respect those scholars that are out there doing, the deep historical, archival, or, sort of different kinds of analyses that I find to be very complementary to the work that I'm doing and the work that we're doing that is very collaborative and very much informed and very much, kind of at the pace of the organizations or the individuals that we work with. So, participatory, working with marginalized communities isn't the only way to transform and move forward, right? And I think that's a really important lesson that I've learned over the years, and also, have benefited from just thinking about, right? Like if we are talking about infrastructure, computational infrastructure and sort of production processes that arise when we have these companies that have so much money and are able to sort of dictate and control the ways in which the technologies come to market, and are quote unquote irresistible or unavoidable. How do I try and put that in conversation with what we're seeing on the ground and the struggles that we're seeing in terms of how people are able to resist individually or ideally collectively. So it's not, I don't want to overemphasize that, but at the same time, the work that we've done, I think is really powerful, and I think it is really valuable. And I have learned so much from my co-organizers over the years, and it's the kind of learning that I can't necessarily get in an institution like this. So it just kind of, is constantly pushing us to think about how we generate knowledge and where knowledge can grow and also travel. So, yeah.
Lina, did you?
Yeah, I would say that I feel like I haven't resolved this, and I find it very, very difficult to do in a way that, I also just think that it would be naive to not recognize your position as an academic in any of these types of situations where power relations are in place, and in terms of the give and take and so forth, it's, I think, quite complicated. We try to do it in the Data Justice Lab by organizing various events and forums in which we can try and bring communities together, which is a lot of the things that we've been trying to do, is get communities in dialogue that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be in dialogue, to try and explore this relationship between technology issues and social justice. But I think we're continuously trying to grapple with ways in which to do that we feel is not extractive and is not and is bringing something back to the communities that we are working with and are in dialogue with. But I think it's, my colleague Philippa Metcalf did the work on migration and did spend a lot of time in Greece. And I think probably that's the kind of work that is required to do this in a way that perhaps feels more participatory in that sense, in proper ethnography, spending time. She was working with asylum seekers and refugees on a daily basis anyway in her work, and was then doing this as part of her research as well. And perhaps it takes that kind of those types of resources and time and so forth to do that properly. And I feel the sort of stuff that we do otherwise in the Data Justice Lab, I would never wouldn't say is necessarily participatory. It is in communication with communities and community groups, and often actually representatives of communities. So I think how to do it, in an engaged way is really hard as academics, and I think it would be naive to pretend otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add one quick thing, which is I think where I sort of end up with this conversation on participatory research is just, it's a question of how you build political power. And right, if doing research in a particular manner can help build political power, then yes, let's do that. I'm always struck by a comment that the co-director of the Justice, Equity, and Technology Table, Ezra Askan, said very early on, which is, we have all of this research, and in this case, she was talking about migration and borders. We have like a plethora of research, and we're still facing the same problems. And that really stuck with me because, it's just like a very refreshing, and real assessment of things. Like, yeah, actually, what we need is somehow to shift something in a different space in order to allow for this information and this knowledge to really have a force. And that feels like the challenge. Like that feels like my challenge as an academic and as an organizer, to think about, okay, like if it's not working to produce more and more research, like where do we need to put our emphasis?
Well, the interests there are quite powerful.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do want to open it up for questions, but maybe we'll end with Yasmin. I wanted to kind of pick up on what you said, kind of about the discourses that you also had to navigate, like the idea of the image of the square. Mm-hmm. But I know that you also had discussions about how your work might be taken up by kind of white savior narratives of, we should like kind of Western humanitarian discourse of intervention and so forth. Did you have discussions with others about this, and how did you?
I mean, there was a concern always when it came to sort of Western media. There was some, media coverage at the time that this was happening, but it was very sort of a news cycle, which is why a lot of people remember that this violence happened in the square. Not a lot of people remember the efforts of Apantish and the other groups, even though they were covered at the time. And of course, there's a concern, which I also had when I was writing the book and writing it in English, that you are adding to the sort of the world's predisposition towards looking at basically at Arab men as sexual criminals, just like in the wait, right? So, but the thing that was, of course, that allowed us to escape that or feel like we were escaping that. And certainly for me with writing the book is that the story here is actually about the fight back. Right. And I think that that also picking up a little bit from what you were saying, Sita, and like thinking about what do we need to shift to, like if I link that back to the last thing I had said about, you know, being part of a defeated generation, living in a, you know, when you live in a space, in a place like Egypt and you need, you know, you need the Facebook and whatever to connect with your communities, to do whatever little margins of like political work you're able to do, you feel trapped within those spaces. And then on a larger scale, if we think about global networks of solidarity, global networks of people who care about justice and injustice, people who want to do something, I feel very much like I am part of, and my communities, my society in many ways is part of the fodder of a sort of habit of consuming social injustice online, where the frame is always focused on victimhood, really, and you know, you're looking for images and stories of people, you know, being living through or dying due to some injustice or other, but you know, what happens when we shift the frame a little bit? And I think about this a lot in relation to Opantish, but also my work on Palestine. What happens when we shift the frame away from this endless victimhood, which we all feel, you know, we all know how awful everything is everywhere, and we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. But what if instead we're networking resistance, creative acts of resistance? I don't know. For me, this is where like we can even begin to have a conversation about useful solidarity towards any sort of shared justice. Yeah. Okay, great. It's a great way to kind of conclude the conversation. But now, like, we would like to open it up. And if you could just please introduce yourself. So yeah, we can start with AJ, and then in the back, and there's one in the middle as well.
I don't know if this is gonna. Oh, it works. Hi. Hi. Oh. Hello. AJ Christian, Northwestern. Thank you so much for this great panel. I actually wanted to pick up on what Yasmin was just saying and connect it to what Sita, you were saying, which is a question now I can't forget, which is, you know, what is this new? We need something other than technology, maybe, to work with. And it reminded me of what you started with, Yasmin, with this like super specific moments in these very specific places, these moments of violence. What you did and what so many others did was a kind of technology, right, to stop violence. And it seems like that's where you kind of ended up, that actually the technologies we need are protocols for solidarity, right? And that those protocols might actually not be technological in terms of silicone, but actually like us, our language, our material. And I'm just wondering if that sparks anything for you in your work. You're seeing people develop rules, norms, practices that are transferable, right, for solidarity.
Yeah, let's take maybe a couple of others.
I'm wondering if we are really, when we talk about what has happened in the at the time of the Arab Spring, and you know what was described as the Facebook revolution and all of that, as the moment which there was a lot of hope and aspirations, but in reality what happened was that it really gave a free hand to these companies to pursue their private interests and to give them a free hand to legitimize what they were actually doing, which was a completely different business plan in shaping, reshaping, and concentrating capital to the extent that we're talking about monopolies enjoying such public power globally that they are really, really out of control today. So if we're going to talk about justice for the future, the first thing that we have to look at is turn the agenda back to them. And justice requires that these companies are broken up. These platforms are really the source of a major, major challenge to democracy, to justice itself. So talking about justice is about controlling what these companies are doing, which is basically an accumulation of not just capital, of power, sucking in these black holes, just sucking everything in. And unless we really go against them properly and use our technology, bring the mathematicians who are working on the algorithms, bring in the workers on the streets who are striking, bring everything together, we really, really cannot do anything.
Thank you. And yeah, we'll take a question here from the middle and then hear from the speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much for fascinating talk. I'm Sami from Simon Fraser University. I really appreciated your remarks, Zita, about your sort of participatory, collaborative, community-based research to be kind of problematic. And especially coming from a journalistic background, now going into academia, I find this to be also problematic as well. Now I'm getting myself into this kind of collaborative research. And the common thing that seems to be addressed in this panel is that we need to find a new language to talk about justice, and also being able to imagine alternatives, new possibilities. So my question is, what are some things that you are doing currently to transform that knowledge production into a form of political power?
Thank you. Yeah, who wants to start?
I don't know. These are really hard questions. Really hard question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're, you know, to start with, thank you. Transferable practices, that's the dream, right? Is to make them and then to find them and learn from others and so on. And I think it's, the key is always, and I think this was actually what was part of what was so difficult for so many people working in different realms of social justice activism around the world, was the sort of the pandemic and the difficulty that came with being isolated from one another. While yes, Zooms and having one another online, but the reality is that for any of this stuff to work in a way that builds power, it has to go offline and then back on, right? So you use it as a tool for sharing, but it's not where any of the like work is happening. It's not where any of the practice building is happening. And I think it's also, maybe we can, you know, I'll quickly remind us that the Arab Spring is often, you know, we talk about it in terms of the technology and the social media revolutions and so on, but like the revolution in Egypt only really took off once they cut the internet from, you know, once they cut people off the internet and off of their cellular phones. The work of Apantish was offline in terms of the work itself and the learning and the building and the tactics and the training and the meetings and all of this stuff. So yeah, remembering that we have to go off and come back on, and I wonder about it again in terms of, you know, you mentioned George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and also I'm thinking about Me Too and the sort of frustration that people felt with, okay, we've said it all, we've spoken, we've done this really hard thing of like saying what has happened and looking at one another's stories and looking at one another's rape and one another's death, and then feeling the sadness of like that we didn't then kind of work together. And I wonder if it was the snowball of just that consumptive habit again and staying online and not going off for a while, you know.
I mean, I can guess, speaking to the last question, but also connecting it to the power of platforms, I suppose that's where, you know, at the moment, in terms of building political power, some of the work that we've been doing as well has also been targeted at policy very directly, in part to try and actually explain the sheer power as these platforms become infrastructures. And what that means also politically as a way to kind of get policymakers to understand some of the issues at hand. So I suppose that's been where some of our interventions have been targeted at. In terms of working with groups, you know, a lot of the work that I've been doing has mainly been with trade unions, and to try and work with them to get a better language for some of the issues as well, but also to try and understand how you organize around some of these issues, because actually that's very difficult. they're often felt as very individualized issues and so forth. So actually organizing collectively around an issue like workplace surveillance is difficult for unions to do. And then there is a question about whether that is where the efforts should lie. And so I think a lot of the discussions we're having at the moment with groups is, there's a limited set of resources for organizing. Where do you direct those resources? Is it to talk about, so to use something like the GDPR, which has been an effective tool to some extent for also for organizing, but actually should you focus your efforts on other things like, in the UK we might want to focus on very punitive trade union laws, for example, as an underlying condition for unions to actually have any power at all in the workplace, right? So I think it's often those kinds of discussions that are being had as to what makes sense in terms of where efforts should lie, but also directly at policy interventions and speaking on terms that make policymakers listen. Right? Yeah.
All great questions and very difficult. I think your first question actually it prompted me to think about another thing that I would be excited if we collectively put our heads together and thought about how to reconceptualize scale. Because I feel like, at least in the US context, there's still such a dominant trend or dominant legacy of US civil rights movement organizing. And some of that sort of transformed and changed with the racial justice uprisings. But I think there's more work to be done there, just in terms of thinking about scale. And then timing, right? Scale and timing feel very important, both in relation to knowledge production, but also in relation to building political power. And just in relation to your question about, sort of stuff that we're already doing, it's definitely the great hope that stuff that we have been doing does have an impact. And we have, I think at our data bodies, we've sort of come up with a set of activities, engagements, ways of engaging the conversation around technology and power that isn't tech focused, that is actually just focused on power and lack of power and injustice, and sort of where people want to be. Right? And the most immediate kind of artifact or the example of that is in our digital defense workbook, playbook. We shouldn't have called it digital defense because actually there's nothing digital in it. We don't do anything digital. A lot of the activities are totally just people-based and relationships, right? And tactile. But what we find is that that's really effective in engaging people and then getting them to think and act further. So we try not to be tech-centered, and maybe I can try and link it to the second question, which is, I agree that there is a lot to be done with using existing levers to break up powerful companies, but I always come back to the example in the US of we broke up AT&T, and then we had the baby bells, and then they reconsolidated and gave us a new monster, right? So I actually think that there's a lot of good organizing that needs to continue within the space of digital rights and using privacy, using even fairness, right? There are things that we can rely on that are very much tech-centered. And I think there's also a larger strategy of just thinking about how we can move, and it's not even on the margins, it's just in a different space, in a different domain, whether that has to do with urban planning, even pension reform seems really relevant, right? One of the reasons why in the United States you can't really attack big technology is because our pensions are tied to the performance of these companies, right? So the biggest pensions groups in the United States for public employees are wholly dependent on the performance of platform companies. So, why are you going to want to dent your retirement future if you haven't dealt with that? So I feel like this is where I certainly would like to make those connections and move to the extent that it's possible in coordination or, sort of surprise timing or, just thinking about that, those intersections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think we ran out of time, unfortunately, but there's a lot of food for thought and the conversation continues. Thank you to the speakers.